have a practice or are you running a business? Valuation is the ultimate KPI.
Hey there, it's Mike Langford. Welcome to the Modern Financial Advisor Podcast, brought to you by Trulytics by Envestnet. This week on the show, I have Greg Procott and Samantha Angel, managing partners at Advisor Financing, with me for an in-depth conversation about a fascinating new trend for advisor succession that is being made possible by firms like Advisor Financing. What is this new trend? Partial sales, or maybe more appropriately, gradual sales of an advisory business. This is huge because, as you'll hear Greg and Sam relate, historically, advisors viewed succession as this pull the ripcord total sale type of transaction where one day you own the business and the next day you're retired, which sadly has led many advisors to hang on to their business way too long, leading to a potential pitfall for their business and their clients. This is a high impact episode of the show. You're absolutely going to love it. But before we get to the conversation with Greg and Sam, please make sure you subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, Amazon, the YouTubes, or wherever you like to get your podcast jam on. And if you have a question or a suggestion for a guest or a topic for the show, hit us up. Simply go to Trulytics.com and use that little contact form there, or shoot us an email, podcast@Trulytics.com. Okay. Let's get to the conversation with Greg and Sam from Advisor Financing. Well, Sam Angel, Greg Procott, wonderful to see you two. Welcome to the Modern Financial Advisor Podcast.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks for having us today.
Wonderful to see you.
I can't wait for this conversation. We've had a few conversations in prep leading up to this thing, and I've really been looking forward to this because this topic we're going to be covering today is so important for the modern financial advisor, right? We talk a lot about succession planning, and Trulytics, who we produce a show for, is all about advisor transition management. And so you guys at Advisor Financing LLC, which that's the last time we'll mention the LLC part.
Perfect.
That's by the way, the website, right? AdvisorFinancingLLC.com. But you guys are playing an instrumental role for this process of advisor transition management and the financing that you provide. So maybe, Greg, you mentioned this, I think, early on in our prep, but maybe just give us a high-level overview of Advisor Financing LLC, and I'm sure we'll circle back to it again, but what do you guys do and why is it important for the ecosystem?
Well, maybe I can talk about the genesis of the firm. It's actually our founding father is a financial advisor, coincidentally, and about 7 years ago, he went to the marketplace. He's a junior partner practice, a lot like the folks that are listening in, and wanted to buy a portion of a senior partner's practice, went to the market, the usual suspects, and found it to be fairly frustrating. Not many entities out there, thought the rates were high. And he thought there's got to be a better way to do it. And so he went out and built it. And so it's a firm of advisor loans designed by an advisor. What we do essentially is this doesn't fit cleanly in a historic banking model. There's no building, there's no equipment, there's no airplane to put up as collateral. And so it's not something they have historically done. So we have gone out, for lack of a better term, we broker these deals. And we have discovered banking partners out in the marketplace who we have trained in the space. They understand it and they like what we bring to them. But truly, we are advocates for the financial advisors. While we partner with the banks, they are very important relationships to us. We are advocates for the advisors. And so we walk them along the whole process from the start to the finish of the closing of the loan.
Fantastic. And Sam, this is different than what advisors may be aware of, right? Because I'm always careful to introduce this concept because most financial advisors have never thought about taking out a loan for their business at all, ever, right? And most financial advisors have never bought or sold a financial advisory business either, right? They're just busy doing their thing. But as advisors think about selling their business or thinking about acquiring another business, historically, we haven't had lending. Like true commercial lending for this business? Because as Greg said, there's no assets really, right? There's no buildings, there's no equipment, there's no true intellectual property really to lend against. What was the traditional methodology for advisors financing M&A deals?
So prior to this, it had really been either SBA financing came into play about 10 years ago or so. There's some covenants and conditions with that. It works for some people. It's not ideal for every situation. Before that, it was really either seller financing, where the seller holds a note for an agreed upon period of time. But with that, they're not receiving a liquidity event where at one specific moment in time, if they just want a large chunk of cash and they want to move on from the business, they're not getting that. So it was really seller financing or an earnout structure, which is very similar. There's a lot of regulations and requirements with that as well. Yeah. But that's where, like Greg mentioned, with working with the banks, partnering with them, educating them, the space has really evolved a lot over, certainly over the last 10 years, but even more so over the past 5, even the past 2, where as banks become more and more comfortable with this, we're able to really meet and match what advisors are looking for. And so fit your specific scenario.
I think it's fantastic.
Can I jump in for a second, Mike?
Oh, yeah, please do.
This whole concept of equity in practice is a really new phenomenon in the industry. It really only goes back maybe 15 or 20 years. And honestly, I think Live Oak did a great service to our industry. They were first to be an institution that would come and bring capital. Sam had just mentioned that seller financing or earnouts were the historic norm, which is great for some, and the seller gets a nice annuity, but they're not really getting a liquidity event. And they're not getting a check for $500K, $1 million, $2-3 million. So Live Oak entered the space, was first to market, and now these advisors can cash a check when they're ready to transition.
That's fantastic. And, this kind of leads us to where that stage set leads us to like a big piece of what I want to talk about today. Because, Greg and you and I were, having this conversation in prep, trying to think about like some of the ideas for this episode. And one of the things that you mentioned kind of just off the top of the dome, just kind of almost as an aside, that I'm like, oh my God, we got to drill into that, is that most financial advisors never sell their business. Right, the majority of advisors, they were kind of retire in place, right, die with their boots on, if you want, whatever you want to call it, right, just like ride it into the ground until the day it's done. And maybe that's because they didn't realize that there were true viable M&A options, right? If it's going to be seller financed, that's a pain in the butt. I don't want to do that, right? And there's probably some other reasons, but why do you see, so many advisors not selling their business? Because, look, succession planning and M&A in our industry, you can't listen to a podcast, read an article, or any type of industry pub without seeing something about this. Why is it that so few advisors are not thinking about exiting?
You are very correct. Historically, advisors have not been financially incented to sell their practices. So let's look at an example. You've got John or Jane Doe advisor. They're entering the twilight of their advisory career. Say their GDC or their revenue, depending on which channel you're in, is $1 million to make the case. So they have two choices. They can sell that practice, straight up sale. And in today's market, that's worth $2.5-3 million. And so right now they could get a check for a significant portion of that. The remainder would likely be in some type of seller finance type of a scenario. But so they get a check for $2.5 million. Well, let's look at the alternative. We've already said they're contemplating retirement, and so they are not necessarily 100% engaged in the practice. Of course, they care about their clients, but they are likely not adding new clients because the potential new clients do not see an end game. And so by all likelihood, there's attrition occurring in the practice and the inevitability of those clients dying off over the course of time. So it's going to go down, but they're going to keep working. So first year they make $1 million. Second year they make $940,000. The next year they make $840,000, so on and so forth. If you look purely at the present value of that, it is very clear that they are financially incented to remain working, not to mention that they get to go visit their advisor client friend in Naples or Palm Springs or Phoenix, all of which being a tax write-off. And so you can see the viability of that, but the pleasure of that That said, as financially rewarding as it is for the financial advisor, is that in fact the best thing for the client? We've already said that the advisor may not be 100% engaged. And so are they keeping up with the latest trends of estate planning, tax laws, portfolio construction, ETF innovations, so on and so on and so on. So, and they don't have anybody checking their work. So are they in fact doing the best thing for their client? I would say potentially not.
Yeah. By the way, I noticed you chose places that all have good like golf experiences there. It's not by accident. For those who are listening and not viewing this episode, you see a lot of golf paraphernalia behind Greg. Naples and Phoenix and Palm Springs, I think all have great golf courses there. But I always jokingly say, advisors, it's a good gig if you can get it, right? You're making really good money. Like you said, some in some cases they're making $1 million a year or, several $100,000s a year. And they're working good hours, right? And they're playing a crap ton of golf. It's a good gig if you can get it type of thing, as they say. But
right.
As you're saying, like, look, as you get older, it can be challenging because you are going to start to see the business decline because, if you're a 65-year-old advisor, most of your clients are probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 65, right? You draw a 5-year circle around there, and that's going to probably be what your book of business looks like. So that you can assume that they're going to get into that consumption phase of their portfolios and start to draw down a little bit. One of the things that I really wanted to dive into today, kind of building off of that, most advisors don't ever sell their business, is maybe we could do a little myth busting, right? Or an exercise in expanding the mindset for financial advisors when it comes to their options for succession or M&A. Because I think most people, solo advisors in particular, are doing a great service in the way that we talk about succession and M&A because they think it as an all or nothing endeavor. Like, oh, I have to sell my business. I have to pick a successor. And then at one point in time, I'm going to ride off into the sunset, right? I'm going to just sell this business. And one day I'm working and the next day I'm retired. And that's just not really the case. So let's dive in. And maybe Sam, you can kick us off. Let's talk a little bit about partial sales. Right? Because this is a new thing that's kind of coming up in the industry. I've heard it bubbling up around here. What is a partial sale and how does it generally work from a financing perspective? Because, obviously that's your focus.
Yeah. So, and this is something that you mentioned earlier that a lot of advisors have never bought or sold a practice. Yeah. And that's where, with Greg and myself and our firm, we work with hundreds and thousands of advisors routinely. So we've seen a little bit of, I'd say every scenario out there, but I'm sure there are a lot that we're missing as well. But so there can be a couple different types of partial sales. There can either be, like Greg mentioned earlier, when, our firm was founded, where you sell to somebody internally within your team and you sell, 30% of your practice and they become a business owner and they take on that. You can also sell a specific segment of clients. So let's say you have, using an easy number, 1,000 clients, you can sell 300 of those clients to that other advisor. You can sell it externally to somebody, maybe within your same broker dealer. You can sell it to somebody completely externally. So there's kind of a lot of different ways. So there's that type of partial sale. And then another partial sale that we see, relatively frequently is where an advisor might have expanded to the point where they say, hey, I've grown a lot. I really want to focus on these types of clients. Or maybe they're nearing retirement and they just want to start slowing down. So maybe they take a segment of their book and sell those specific clients and just offload that portion. So there's a couple of different ways. There's the true succession planning where hey, this individual is going to be taking over my business. I'm going to sell them 30% now, 30% in a few years, 30% in 5 years. Or you can also just sell some of your clients off as well. Yeah. So a couple of different types that we routinely see.
I love it. So I think there's two types of kind of partial sale that you hit on that, and I'm sure there's multiple, but like two big categories that popped up in my brain. So you guys obviously dive in and correct me where I might be off. But one that jumped out to me was selling to an internal, an advisor, a junior advisor maybe, or a group of junior advisors, right? So in the case that you have a multi-advisor practice, one's the owner, and then there's other advisors that have been hired over the years to also do some work. What's that process look like? Because I suspect it's slightly different than an external advisor coming in to buy a chunk of the firm because One would think that an external advisor has a big book of business that he or she is also, going to bring on and kind of as the firms merge. But here it is an example. I'm an employee and I'm going to buy part of Greg's business. My clients are technically the firm's clients, I guess. How do I go about getting financing to buy a chunk of the business from Greg so that I become an owner? What does that look like?
Yeah. So, you're leading into the case of succession planning, which is marvelous because let's go back to the example that I used earlier, the straight up sale. Let's take that same individual and go 5 to 10 years previously. And it's like, I don't want this practice to die with me. I want to add some folks. I want to bring on a next generation, cultivate some talent, bring on 1, 2, or more junior advisors to come in behind you. You cultivate them, you mentor them over the course of 5 or 10 years. They develop specialties. One's developed in portfolio analysis. One handles your social media elements. And you start working exclusively with the top end of your client base. You start to delegate some to them. And as you get more comfortable with them and they get more comfortable with you, you bring in the opportunity to pass ownership on to them. So as Sam had just stated, you sell 10, 20% tranches to them over the course of time, give them skin in the game. They're excited about that concept. So then they would then come to us. We facilitate that transaction for them. And we're working a lot with internal transitions of that nature.
That's awesome.
One of the positive things about doing an internal transition plan like that is, say you've been working with somebody for 5 years. They're already going to be familiar with your name. In this case, let's pretend Greg and I are the advisors and Greg is selling a portion to myself. The clients will already know my name. They'll be familiar with my face from having, seen us in the office, gone to events with us. So it's not going to be a huge change where all of a sudden they're like, wait, who's this person that I'm supposed to be working with now? So that helps from a client retention standpoint as well, which again is really important when you're selling your business, that you want to make sure that that business stays strong and there's not as large of a threat for clients to leave and find somebody else. So that familiarity helps from that aspect as well.
And I imagine that's similar, that result, if you will, or that feeling of comfort also works when it's an external advisor buying into the firm as well as in a partial sale, right? So, most advisors and people think about like how awkward it must be if Mike comes in to buy all of Greg's practice and say, Greg, I'm going to buy your business and I'm going to give you $2 million. And thanks, Greg. See ya. And the next day I'm going to talk to the clients like, hey, everybody, great to meet you. My name is Mike. You never met me before. Greg sold me the business. That's not the way it works, I know. But in the partial sale, Greg's like, hey, we're bringing on a new partner. Mm-hmm. Meet Mike. He's coming in. He's acquired a part of our business. Call it a merger, call it whatever you want to call it. He's got his existing book of clients. Start introducing us around over time, right? I think that's a big value. It adds kind of a better runway, right, for the eventual succession.
Yeah. That's a great point, Mike. You look to my example and I talked about the next gen, but let's bring in people in the same generation, other partners who have different specialties, different networks. So you're really creating an organization there. And then you start talking about a third generation of advisors and it becomes a legacy and you've really created something that will take care of your clients and their next generations.
So, Mike, what you were saying also brings up another good point that one of the most common questions we get actually is, when should I start looking about making a succession plan? Or when should I start learning about financing to buy into my practice? And we always say, the sooner the better. Even if you're 5-10 years out, obviously the terms might change a little bit. Yeah. Interest rates, I could be wrong, but they're probably not going to be the exact same today that they are in 5 or 10 years. Right. But that's where the sooner that you do that and start thinking about your transition plan and your succession plan, the sooner that you're able to bring those individuals into your firm, make sure that they have the same type of practice that you do, that they're going to treat the clients the same, and make sure that it's a good fit so that, again, your business is very successful overall.
That's fantastic. So let's kind of break it down to two different ways for those two different potential buyers, right, of partial sales. how does the process for qualifying for financing work, right? So, if I'm an external buyer, I see Greg's business, and Greg and I have started talking. He's like, yeah, why don't you buy into the business and we'll gradually do a succession plan. It'll be great to have you on with the firm. We'll call it a merger, but you basically are buying a chunk of the practice. How do I go about securing financing for that? Do I have to bring a down payment? Do I come in and say, hey, listen, I've got $200,000, 10% down to buy, whatever, this multi-million-dollar stake in Greg's business? Or is it is it 100% financing? How does this work? I guess for the novice out there who's like, okay, I've never bought a business before. I've never thought about buying a piece of the business, which I suspect is everyone. How does this work?
Generally speaking, the buyer doesn't necessarily have to come with capital to the transaction. What the bank wants to see is the vibrance of the practice that they are joining, the vibrance of the practice that they have, and the health of their personal balance sheet. A lot of times advisors logically assume that, well, this thing's going to cash flow like crazy. Of course, the bank's is going to do it. Yeah. But let's remember, this is a fairly new space. Banks are already not necessarily comfortable because, again, there's no hard collateral there, no building. And so they want you to have demonstrated being a good steward of your own capital. Probably heard the old saying that banks don't want to lend unless you don't need the money. And there's an element of truth to that. But when somebody comes to us and the bank with a strong balance sheet that demonstrates they've been prudent with their own capital, makes them a good risk, which is what the banks are looking for. So oftentimes somebody in a senior position will have the glide path where they've been able to accumulate some assets. It's a bit more of a challenge when the junior partners come in because they have not had that glide path. Yeah. Historic pattern there is, they've been in the business 5 or 10 years. They start to make a good living. They buy a little nicer house. They buy a little nicer car. They buy a little nicer clothing, and they got to put their kids through school. So they may not have had an opportunity to accumulate liquidity in their own portfolio yet. So oftentimes we will ask the senior partner to come alongside them and be a co-signer on it. The junior is likely taking the loan, but the senior is a co-signer. We'll occasionally get pushback there, understandably, because it might be perceived as a risk, but let's look at that risk. You have handpicked your successor. The transition will be virtually 100% of clients will stay on. So there's essentially no risk there. And if you're telling me there's risk, then the bank is supposed to assume that risk. We might assume that banks are supposed to take on risk. Honestly, just the opposite. They do not want to take on risk. And so having the senior advisor come alongside their junior partner demonstrates their belief in the whole process and makes it pretty smooth sailing.
Very interesting. It's very interesting. It's again, it's also new to folks, right? To think about doing this, but there's so many reasons to consider doing it, right? So one of the ones we talked about, you keyed up, Greg, was lightening the workload for you, right? As you get older, you want to spend some more time enjoying what you've built in the world. If you're married, your spouse might be like, "Hey, I thought we were going to travel more. I thought we were going to do some stuff. Like, don't you have junior advisors to take care of this mundane stuff? Like, aren't you sick of preparing your quarterly reports to meet with your clients? Why can't we start taking some more time off? Maybe I want to spend more time in Naples, or I was just in San Diego. Maybe I want to spend more time in San Diego. It's awesome.
There's golf there too."
So we're going to talk a little bit about like some of the ways that advisors can benefit from this partial sale, and because look, I think we've kind of articulated some of the mechanics of doing so. One of the ones that you mentioned, I think, Sam, was that you're taking some money off the table, right?
Yeah, so there's a couple different benefits actually, both to the selling advisor and then to the purchasing advisor as well, if you're doing a partial sale like this. To the selling advisor, exactly like you stated. I mean, they might have more time to spend with their family and friends and be able to take a little bit of a step back from the business, relieve some of those responsibilities that they might not want to do. Maybe I won't guarantee this, but maybe somebody's 65 years old and they don't want to run the firm's Twitter account because they just don't see a value in that and they don't know how to do that. Great. Pass that along as part of the responsibility. So that's, some of the benefits to the selling advisor. And then of course, they're also going to be receiving that liquidity event where they're receiving a chunk of cash for their business, and they can choose what to do with that capital. If they want to go spend it all, great. If you want to invest it, great. It's up to you as to what you'd like to do with that. Then from the purchasing advisor, one, they're getting their foot in the door with the business. They're starting to really solidify that succession plan. And down the road, when they're ready to make that full practice purchase and the selling advisor is going to be leaving entirely, then they already have some equity in the business. So to use easy numbers, let's say that they're buying the practice for $10 million or that the practice is worth $10 million. If they already own 20% of that, then you know that they've got a stake in there. So they have some capital, they have that liquidity, well, not that liquidity, but they've got that asset behind them, which makes it easier to lend as you continue down this path as well.
I love the whole like taking money off the table thing. And I know it sounds kind of, simplistic, but listen, you got a business and most financial advisors, they probably have their own portfolio. They've been investing over the years, but that business is probably one of their largest assets. And that's true for basically every business owner, right? And it's it's a highly illiquid asset. Like the only way to get money out of it is either sell it or take out some sort of loan. And by the way, that's an option too. You can do some refinancing and take some money off the table. And I'm sure you guys do those types of deals, even though we've been talking about partial sales here for a good chunk. But taking money off the table so that you can enjoy life while you're young without having to let go of the reins 100% on the business. Because, as Greg was saying, hey, you might love this business. You might love your clients. And so now the ones that I like going golfing with or that it brings joy to me because I've seen their kids grow up and them and their spouse go through the careers and so forth. And every time I see them, this is what a wonderful journey we did together. You don't want to let go of that, but it would be nice to buy that vacation house, or it would be nice to have some money to, pay for your grandchildren's college or whatever.
Yep. You're able to diversify your portfolio.
Yeah. That's another reason.
Hopefully this isn't your only asset that you have, but if the only asset you have is your business, selling a portion of that helps you to diversify, which I think we can all agree is a good thing.
Yeah.
And to your point, Mike, there's not that many businesses where you can take a portion off the table. Most businesses, plight of the small business owner, virtually 95 to 99% of their net worth is in that business. Yeah. And to be able to pull chips off the table, as you stated, I happen to be a Texas Hold'em player also, so I love that analogy also.
You're speaking Greek to me. Gambling and poker. My dad used to have these poker games like every Friday night my mom worked at nights at a store, and so he'd have all my uncles over and they play. I just liked it because I used to get sodas and stuff like that. And
well, you're using the vernacular. Chips off the table is very much a poker analogy.
There you go. I'm a total. I hate losing. That's my problem when it comes to gambling stuff. I don't want to lose. It just sounds awful to me. But now you're seeing some of my. I'm risk tolerant when it comes to things I can be active in. But we're talking about de-risking the business a little bit too, right? Bringing on another partner, selling a piece of the business, actually de-risk the business, especially when we're dealing with solopreneurs, solo advisors. Man, that whole, if you get hit by the proverbial Uber, as one of the founders of Trulytics is fond of saying, instead of getting hit by a bus, what happens to you and your business, but also what happens to your clients? They're relying on you. So by bringing somebody else on, it goes from just a practice to a real business, right? We've got two owners at least. We've got two people who care about the future of this business that are starting to think about systematizing things and so forth. So that de-risking is a really important factor, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's the discussion about becoming not just an advisor, but a business owner. And so the staying power of the clients in that scenario, they feel much more comfortable knowing that there is a deep team of partners at all levels that can not only take care of them, but specialize in particular areas of practice management.
Sam, like as I start to think about this, I imagine the advisor who's listening, right? And they're like, this sounds awesome, right? Let's do this. Let me start. And by the way, there's probably some apprehension too. Like especially if you've been running your own business and it's just been you and maybe an assistant or whatever for a while. Man, the notion of bringing somebody else into your baby has got to be a little nerve-wracking. And you guys mentioned something else. There's that phrase, going open kimono, right? Of like, hey, here's the business. Let me show you all that is underneath here. And one thing that I know about this industry is because many advisors got into the business when they were called stockbrokers, and they had a job and it's all about sales, sales, sales. They're always thinking, hey, the money's coming next quarter. I get another commission check or whatever. And then now that we're in the fee revenue, my fee roll goes, and this is awesome. Well, many of the practice management professionals at broker dealers were telling me, hey, a lot of these guys, they live $500,000 lifestyles, but they're making $400,000 a year. And so their own personal houses are kind of in disarray. What are some recommendations you have for an advisor who's like, you know what, I want to sell a piece of my business, but my own personal house is in array a little bit, or I want to buy a business. How do I go about like getting this stuff in shape so I can qualify to buy another business and do this thing?
Well, that's where one of the things that I mentioned earlier is the question we get, when should I start planning for this? And that answer, always as soon as possible. The sooner that you know what financing is available and what's out there, what your options are, what you might be required to bring to the table or not, the better position you're going to be in when it's time to execute on those things. So that's where, for the purchasing advisor, knowing what you might be required to the table. Are you required to bring any capital? Do you need to have cash up front, or are you going to be able to finance the entire thing? Making sure that you're getting, like Greg mentioned earlier, your personal finances in order so that you are a strong steward of your own capital. It's going to make it easier when you are obtaining that capital to get the best interest rate, to get the best terms, and to be able to execute on what your goals are.
And Greg, when you look at the advisors that you've been working with, are there any things that like pop out to you as like some common traits that you're like, hey, that makes a good buyer, or in some cases a good seller, I guess. So let's start with a buyer. Are there certain things that you see that like, hey, this makes a really good buyer for a transaction?
Yeah, you're getting into what the bank likes to see to position yourself for acquisitions, and what they like to see is a strong practice of your own. Of course, AUM, what's your revenue? How much of it is recurring? Demonstrate capacity. Have you built the team? Do you have a next gen that can take on a younger generation of client? Do you have the senior people that know the sophisticated levels of planning? And again, demonstrate that you've been a good steward of your own capital. That positions you as a strong buyer. On the flip side, what impacts the value of a selling practice? I mentioned AUM and revenue. How much of that is recurring? What are the demographics of that practice? Are all your clients over 70 years old? Is this a practice that's in net outflow or net inflow? When you demonstrate net inflow, that has a significantly higher value than a practice that's eroding. And also, people like the human capital element of it. In this day and age of 3.5% unemployment, imagine adding another CFP or two, or a CFA, or a certified associate assistant, or you're really adding to your foray or your army of support when you can acquire the human capital as well.
That's really smart.
So to expand on what Greg said a little bit as well, especially when we're looking at personal financials, and we've talked about Palm Springs, we've talked about Scottsdale, we've talked about Naples. If you have, I live in Minnesota here, so if you have your house in Minnesota and then you have vacation homes in Palm Springs, Scottsdale, Naples, you've got one over in Germany, you've got one here, and you have mortgages on all of those, you're not really having any assets, and you've got a lot of debt, that can raise some questions. So just some pieces like that where, we understand this is life. A lot of people have a mortgage. A lot of people have car loans, things like that. But again, once you get into having 12, 15, 25 mortgages, raises some questions, significant credit card debt. Yeah. Some of those pieces are where, the bank looks at that as a risk. Yeah. And ultimately that is something that, minimizing that debt is something that's going to be able to help you as a potential borrower, is not having an incredible amount of debt.
Now, how about the match between the businesses? The Truelytics team talks about this a lot, right? When they talk about succession planning and matchmaking, if you will, of looking at the post M&A fit, if you will, of the two businesses, right? That the value of the business is often in the eye of the beholder. Sure, there's some AUM calculation that says this is what the valuation of that cash flow from that this business generates is. However, if I'm a buyer, I want to make sure that I can, at least even if I'm buying a piece of the business, I want to make sure that this is going to be a good integration, right? Or you think about any merger that we see in the public markets where one company buys another company or whatever, there's got to be some cohesion after the fact, right? It can't just be a hot mess of like, how are we going to work together?
Yeah, there's a lot of factors that go into that, both between yourself and the partner you're looking at bringing on, and then also how the client experience is. So, if you're somebody that's going to call and text and email at all hours of the day and you expect the other person to be available, but the other person wants to work 9 to 5 and that's it, that might not be the best fit. Same thing where from the client experience, if you have quarterly meetings, you like 2 of those meetings to be in person, 2 of them virtual. You also, you've got your business very streamlined as to what your touch points are. And the other person says, I meet with people once a year, and if they call me, I'll answer the phone. That might not be the best fit from a client experience, because when one of those 2 eventually sells to the other, it's a totally new experience for that client.
Culture is obviously very important, and we like to see these partnerships succeed, obviously, but we've also all unfortunately witnessed those that have not. And so generally speaking, we've seen folks join who have known each other for an extended time frame. So hopefully that gets you past a majority of the learning curve, but you never know until you're in the same office.
Yeah. Well, earlier in the conversation, Sam, you mentioned the fact that, for most advisors, they're doing this for the first time. We brought that up. But for you and Greg and the team there at Advisor Financing, you guys have done this hundreds, if not thousands of times by now, right? So you've had many data points, and you've seen some that work nice and smoothly, and you see ones that have had some rocky road to get there, and then some that are probably after the fact probably wish they had not done this merger or M&A deal. What do you do when advisors contact you, right? So what's the process? So let's kind of like, as we're kind of starting to round third head for home here, what's the process for working with you? Do you take a consultative approach there, consultative approach with advisors when they walk in the door, like, hey, before we start talking about money, let's start talking about you, the business, and all that. Talk us through that.
Absolutely, we do. So one of the first things is just learning more about what your situation is. That helps us to be able to provide some guidance. If you're coming to me, you've got a purchase agreement, you know that you're closing January 1st, you know exactly the amount of financing you want, you know exactly how everything is structured, then I don't need to, start at square one and tell you what your options are, what you're looking at, have that more consultative approach. So we frequently speak with individuals that have things buttoned up, that know exactly what they're doing. Then we've got people who say, hey, I'm looking at doing this maybe in 6 months or so. What's it like? Again, people that are looking years out. So providing that education dependent upon where you're at in your journey. And that's where, generally we always are going to ask some questions about yourself first, so that we're able to best tailor and educate you. If you are one of the individuals that's made a dozen acquisitions in the past, you probably don't need to know some of the details that somebody that it's their first time does. And that's where, because Greg and I and our team has worked in this space for so long, that's where we've seen all of these different types of deals. And once we know what you're looking at, we're able to best guide and give you the answers and the questions that you're looking for.
I love it. What have been, I guess to wrap it up, this is one of the interesting ones for me. What have been like some train wreck things to watch out for? Like, have you ever, I know it's not a good way to end it, but like, if this situation presents itself, like, hey, watch out for this. Like if you're a buyer and you're considering buying a piece of the business, is there any like things you should be on alert for?
Yeah, I'd say a lot of folks have probably heard the ratios that are out there of buyers as opposed to sellers.
Yeah.
And it's been portrayed that it's 30, 40, 50 times the number of buyers than there are sellers. I would say that is overstated. I've spoken to various field leaders of some broker dealers, and they said, if you talk to any advisor, they'll say, yes, I want to buy a practice. But if you come to them and you have a practice for sale, You might get, well, this timing might not be right. And I don't know that I have the capacity. So realistically, the ratio is probably more 6 to 8 times, which is still very much favoring the seller. There's this very strong market for them. David Grau Sr., who's a kind of a forefather of this succession space, wrote a great book, Succession Planning for Financial Advisors. And he said it's a seller's market controlled by buyers, because if you're selling, you are, in fact, almost always doing it only once, where buyers might go into multiple purchases like Sam just alluded to. And since they've done it before, they have that. Now, I guess to your point of what would you caution against? Winning a bidding war. Multiples have been increasing over time. We've seen some presentations by SRG, and they show that about 7 years ago, we were at 2.62 times recurring revenue. It's now 2.87, and that was continuing to progress higher. Well, now we've seen a turnaround in interest rates, and it's a lot like home purchases where rates go up, your payments go up. That means the pricing comes down. So if you're winning a bidding war, did you in fact win? Or are you going to align yourself with the seller because your cultures align? And so frequently, the seller will not necessarily sell to the highest bidder, but to what they perceive as the best cultural fit for their clients.
I love that. That's a fantastic way to put it. Like, look for fit. Price matters, of course, right? If somebody's like half the price, that they're willing to pay, then obviously we might be talking about something different. But if there's 2 or 3 competing buyers for the business, pick the one that's the best fit. I mean, it may be a slightly smaller price, but like the end value, especially if you're doing a partial sale, by the way, if you've got a couple of people looking to buy in, you don't want to be selling to somebody who's just not going to be a good fit and be disruptive to the business, and you're doing a disservice to your clients.
And one of the other points too, especially, talking about multiples, is it's going to depend whether you're talking about a multiple of revenue or are you talking about a multiple of the EBITDA. Yeah. Most frequently for broker-dealer practices, we see talk about a multiple of revenue. Yeah. Generally, anywhere 2.5 to 3 times recurring revenue. And then in the RIA space is where you'll hear a lot more, I just sold for a multiple of 10 or a multiple of 15, because they're talking about EBITDA, and you really need to look at exactly how that's calculated. So that's where, there are times where a seller says, hey, I want to sell for a 10 times multiple, because they hear that exists out there, not understanding or knowing that, that might not be their space that they're in.
Right. Fantastic. Really smart, really smart. And I'll throw another one back to the founder there of Truelytics, used to say, hey, listen, I'll let you set the price if I can set the terms of the deal, right? So a lot more matters than just the price of the deal. It's going to be, again, what's the terms look like? What do things look like post-integration of the M&A deal, whether that's partial or complete sale? So make sure you look through the details. Make sure you look for a fit. This has been fantastic, Sam, Greg. I'm sure people are going to want to follow up with you. We'll make sure we get the book linked up that you just mentioned, Greg. But I want to make sure we get people to you as well. What's the best way for people to reach out and stay connected with you guys?
Yeah, so best way, we've got our website available. You've got my contact information, Mike. Yeah. So if anybody reaches out to you directly, you've got my contact information, Greg's contact information. And our job here is to be advocates for the advisors. So that's where we're always going to guide you to the best space for yourself. So yeah, we've got our website, like you mentioned at the very beginning of the show. That's going to be advisorfinancingllc.com. That has our emails, that has our phone numbers, and we're happy to take it from there.
Fantastic. Well, Greg Procott, Sam Angel, so wonderful having you on the show. Thank you very much. Great having you.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you very much for listening to and/or watching this episode of the Modern Financial Advisor podcast. It's always fantastic to have you with us. Huge thanks to Greg Procott and Samantha Angel from Advisor Financing for joining me as well. The financing provided by firms like theirs is a game changer. It's opened up so many new options for independent financial advisors and RIAs. Be sure to swing by their partner page on the Truelytics website to learn more. I'll actually get a link in the show notes if you want to just go there and click it. Nice and easy, okay? Lastly, as I mentioned at the top of the show, please make sure you subscribe to the podcast on your preferred podcast platform. if you haven't done so already, of course, and give the episode a share on LinkedIn. Chances are, if you found this interesting, so will other people in your network. So just click the share button, man. Not that hard to do. Let people know about the podcast, okay? All right, that's it for today. As always, be nice to each other. We will see you next time on the Modern Financial Advisor Podcast. See ya. Bye.